Welcome to the Thriving Farmers Podcast, where our mission is to inspire, educate, and celebrate sustainable farming. We believe that you can build a profitable and sustainable farm that gives you true farm freedom. Join us as we talk to farmers, innovators, educators, and entrepreneurs to glean their top takeaways in business and life. So today's podcast episode is all about food safety and what it means for small farms. And so what we did is we actually brought on 3 guests, and they are all work with the UVM extension to help farmers with food safety. So the first is Chris Callahan. Now, Chris, I've worked with Chris for a number of years on a couple different projects, and he is the Associate Professor of Agriculture Engineering at University of Vermont and focuses on food systems. We also brought on Andy Chamberlain, who is an ag engineer for UVM Extension, and he focuses more on educating farmers on produce safety and post-harvest handling. And the third person we brought on was Hans Estrin, who's a produce safety specialist for UVM Extension. He co-developed UVM's practical produce safety program in 2010, and since 2014 has developed and coordinates the Community Accreditation for Produce Safety, CAPS, with the Vermont Vegetable and Berry Growers Association. Now, we actually ran out of time to talk about CAPS, which I think is a really cool program. Basically, it's the state has taken the first step in working with their farms for food safety instead of letting it be a federal mandate. So they've done a great job with that, and we will have them back on to discuss that at a later point. Actually, it was a long episode, and they actually had a meeting right after this, so we had to cut it short. So hope you enjoy this. I think it will clear up a lot of common misconceptions about food safety. And, these 3 guys are out there doing great work, and I hope you enjoyed this episode. Welcome to the podcast, gentlemen. Why don't you go ahead and give us a 2-sentence background of who you guys are?
Hey, Michael, it's Chris Callahan here, University of Vermont Extension, Agricultural Engineering. I'm also director of the Northeast Center to Advance Food Safety, which is a regional training education outreach center intended to support producers and processors in the Northeast region.
Hey, I'm Andy Chamberlain with University of Vermont Extension as well. I'm an ag engineering technician who works with Chris Callahan on post-harvest handling and food safety outreach and education.
Welcome, Andy.
Thanks.
My name is Hans Estrin, and I also work with the University of Vermont Extension as a produce safety specialist, and I also coordinate community accreditation for produce safety, the CAPS program, and that's a partnership with the Vermont Vegetable Berry Growers and also Vermont Agency of Ag, Food and Markets, and work a lot with on market development as well with farms around the state.
Welcome. So what brought you gentlemen into the agricultural space? What excites you every day about your job?
I get excited going to work because I get to work with motivated people. Working with farmers is a rather fun demographic, and it's certainly different than a traditional office space because these people are business owners and they need to be motivated in order to succeed in what they're doing. So I really get a lot of joy out of that the farmers are really, really motivated and energetic and take us very seriously. And we joke around and stuff, but
you're feeding Vermont. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. The work we do is quite important. Feeding the people with healthy, local, delicious food certainly is an empowering and motivating task.
So to that point, what does sustainable agriculture and more specifically a sustainable farm mean to you?
Sustainable farming isn't just about the environment. That's a big aspect of it. But I see the sustainable farm that it needs to be a sustainable business and also a sustainable life. If the farmer doesn't have a good work-life balance and they're just running themselves into the ground, the business is going to fail. And then sustainable agriculture doesn't matter anymore because the business is gone and the farm is gone. So I see sustainable agriculture more than just the soil and the air quality, but the quality of life.
Absolutely. Chris or Hans?
I got into agriculture because I discovered an entrepreneurial bone in my body. I came from a teaching background, high school science teaching. My parents were teachers. My grandparents were teachers. None of us ever had businesses. And I also love to grow food. And I had a real interest in sustainability and community. And all these things kind of came together. And I helped start a business with a farmer up the road, Harlow Farm, that's still going now. And that's what got me into this. And I'm really fascinated, like Andy, with just working with folks that are thinking creatively all the time about how to stay afloat. And then more importantly, just to find the key to all of these disparate things, where if you can create a business that makes money actually developing soil in a local community and pulling people together and keeping money in the community, then all the sustainability stuff, kind of really comes together right there. And that, to me, to have businesses that are successful in building ties between people in a community or different groups of people, that's what makes me want to go to work every day, working with people who are all doing that.
That's really good.
Yeah. So, based on, you've just heard Hans and Andy describe why they work in the space and what keeps them going. And to me, that's their passion and their dedication is sort of an example of what attracts me about it as well. They're great people to work with, and then we all get to work with a broader community that's really pulling together. I came to the agricultural space in a very roundabout way, in a very unorthodox way. I started my career working in aerospace as a systems engineer, and ended up reading a very influential paper, a journal article that was an energy balance on the Earth, of all things, and it sort of slapped me over the head with, where the work really matters is on the ground, literally. And so that's what really motivated me to start thinking about applying engineering to the agricultural sector. And the road was windy, but I made it here eventually. And what excites me every day about my job is, I'm cursed with curiosity. And this is a field where there are questions every day that you would never expect. Growers and farmers are inquisitive, curious people, and there is just constantly new ideas and new challenges. And it's a super place to be.
Cool.
And I think, Chris, your systems thinking really helps keep our team with our eyes on the prize and focused on telling stories of what we've done and describing the impact. And that's really helpful. So taking that aerospace kind of systems thinking, applying it to our team has been real helpful.
Yeah. I know actually one of my favorite former CEOs is the guy that was in Boeing for a while. His name was, then he went to run Ford for a number of years, Alan Mulally. And if you ever read his book about when he turned Ford around, just the thinking that went into it. So I think people that come from the aerospace is a special breed. So I know working with Chris, you and I have worked on a few projects, and it's just been a pleasure how your mind thinks and just how the stuff. Yeah. So anyway, that's cool.
Right, let's talk about somebody else.
I think we're just saying, Chris, we appreciate you.
Thanks.
So we know that farmers are an educated and innovative bunch. Tell us about the most influential lesson or idea that you've learned from farmers and how it has helped you in your work.
I want to hear from Hans on this first.
Well, let's see, influential idea or thing. I can't, it depends on the farmer. I guess what has been so influential is the alignment of the strong personalities with action and intention. So, for example, I think of Paul Harlow, who has been a leader in the organic movement and created one of the bigger farms in the state. And, I'd sit down and talk to him, and, he'd just sit there and listen for a while, kind of with his head nodding up and down. I'm like, Paul, so how about we go, throw a bunch of your stuff and other farms and deliver to schools and hospitals in the area or whatever. He's going to think about it for a while. And then he's like, okay. And that pause, and I just tell that story because it's happened again and again. And he has been this person who, whether he's on a board or has created Deep Root Organic or starting businesses, he just takes chances and he does play poker. He does stuff like that. So that was a real influential moment I remember, and sort of thinking about that chance taking around building connection.
Yeah, I'll add on to that. This is a really good question, Michael. And it to me, there's been so many influential lessons. I sometimes feel like I'm the learner more than the people I'm charged with helping to train and educate and support. But the one thing that stood out for me was the idea that anything is possible. And, growers are constantly presented with challenges and find a way. And so there's one conversation I can remember with somebody, I'll call it an old timer, and we were working on a project together. And I piped up and said something like, "Well, it should probably be portable, don't you think?" And he just turned to me and said, "Come on, Chris, everything is portable. We can move anything." So that kind of spirit of, we'll find a way, was sort of a big lesson for me.
So if there was a magic reset button as it relates to starting farms, what systems would you like to see farms go back and put into place sooner rather than later?
I'll start with that. I taught in the outdoor wilderness education field for a while. We used to have this prior planning prevents piss poor performance, the PPPP. And that is, something that is real helpful for me personally, but I've seen it on farms all the time. And relating to a reset button, this sense that really taking the time up front when setting up systems or pack sheds, it's not necessarily spending a ton of money, but really thinking carefully through the flow and the efficiency, and thinking about this really like the lean farm idea of reducing or minimizing waste of walking in circles or back and forth, and also thinking about working conditions and what do I really want out of I'm spending so many hours here, and maybe a couple more windows and some nice lighting and a good stereo system and that kind of thing. Again and again, I've seen farmers who do it and have done it really love it, and others go back to it.
Yeah, I think so often we see farmers decide they need a wash and pack shed when they have a pile of produce sitting there on the ground saying, "Oh, I got to process this somewhere."
That's right.
Yeah, Hans, you kind of said it, or separately from your PPPP principle. A teacher once told me, "Well planned is half done," and that was always his motto to go by. And I've found that certainly has come true in the ag space, and farmers have been quite satisfied when they'd put in a lot of planning up front. So it's certainly fun to help farmers plan out their new wash pack space, so they're not just out there standing next to their stack of produce wondering what to do with it now.
But it's interesting. What's interesting too is that the opposite is also true, that success really relies, I think, on that planning, but also on that, all of the farmers that are really innovative and successful are all very flexible and can be nimble and respond in the moment and be like, "Oh, I didn't plan that." And, let's throw this over here. And why don't we pull some coaster wheels off that refrigerator in the back shed and do this kind of in the moment stuff as well. So, it's funny that we both say that and also know that successful farmers really have to hold a lot of different skills.
And hindsight's 20/20, right? So nobody gets into farming to plan a pack shed or to fill out human resource labor paperwork or to keep records, right? So I think that's the other part of it is you not necessarily starting a business, but you're starting to grow stuff when you start. And so I think the reality is oftentimes the businesses develop over time, somewhat organically. And I think it's hard to plan completely for everything, but being able to respond is a critical skill, right?
And it's interesting that we've evolved our team and sort of what is recommended, and with this design stuff, planning wash pack sheds, the plan now is get a footprint. It's open. It's a clean slate. You've got potentially water overhead, but why don't you wait on that until you figure out how you use it, put some things on wheels, push them around, get set up so that you can actually move into that clean slate and know that, you can plan up to a certain extent, but you got to plan for flexibility and plan for growth. So you think a door should be 3.5 feet wide because you measured all your stuff. Well, add at least 20% to that. Why? Because you're not paying attention, you're making curves, you're hitting things, you got to plan for that and plan, in redundant ways, like I'm going to do this, but I'll also be doing this. So I'm going to put this same thing in 2 places or, that kind of thing.
I think the one, reset button, to use your term, Michael, it sort of pops up for me is, having some sense of where you want to be. Someone recently said to me, at some point you got to decide whether you're a fork truck farm or a hand carry farm.
Yeah.
And so having some sense of, why am I in this and what does ultimate success look like? And that I think can outline, okay, so that means I need human resource systems in place. I need to know how I'm going to manage people. I need to know what records are going to be important to keep and what things to pay attention to, or, what sort of series of number 2 people am I going to need? Am I going to grow to a point where I need a post-harvest manager and separately a field manager? Those sorts of decisions about just thinking ahead. Broad planning, not locked down planning at a super high level of detail, but just where am I headed?
And that is often based in personality too, which is really interesting to me. I think you hit the nail on the head, Chris. And then I guess I'll shy away from names here, but, two examples. One farmer who we all may know, she's really successful, it's a great farm. I just want to be out with my crew every day. That's what I want to do. So therefore, X, Y, and Z, put that together. This is the size farm. Another farm we've been working with is like, I hate people. I don't want any employees. I don't want to work with people. And,
customers too, while you're at it. Okay.
Yeah. You know what? I'm just going to have a fork, pallet stuff and do wholesale, keep it really simple, few crops, and I don't want any employees. So, that's and just knowing themselves and setting up for that and thinking ahead.
No, I think that's a really, really key point that you guys brought up there. Because, knowing what success looks like in your book is the key for every system that you set up on your farm. So let's move into food safety. The FSMA was enacted a couple years ago, and it's still in the process of being implemented. Where exactly are we in that process right now?
The rubber is hitting the road. That's my encapsulation.
Next question. No. The Food Safety Modernization Act is final. And then there are several rules that the FDA has been authorized to develop by that act. And so the two main rules that we tend to deal with are the Preventive Controls for Human Foods rule, which deals with processing food, so changing its form. So we're not talking about raw agricultural commodities or what we would call produce. That is covered by the Produce Safety rule. And that rule has also been finalized. So those two rules have been finalized, and they tend to influence a lot of our work. Primarily the produce safety rule. And so we say the rule is final, and it is, but there's still a lot of details being worked out. And a lot of that is really where three of us and the rest of the world are focusing our work, is understanding what the language actually means in the rule, and then also trying to develop resources and lower, not capital G, but lower G guidance to help growers understand what that actually looks like in practice. So that, in a nutshell, is where the rules at.
So I know that they've finalized the water and compost regulations.
So they exist in a final form. However, the water regulation in particular is under review. In particular, the appropriate test methods for demonstrating compliance with that rule. Hans or Andy, you guys want to add anything?
Just that it's a 10-year research process, and I know that they're uncovering, it's just like compost is not only more complicated than we think, it's more complicated than we can think. And there's a lot of different variables that have to do with climate and regions. And so there's trying to gather some hard science around pathogens and compost systems. And it's long time coming to get that support. It may end up looking like the resolution might be a little higher depending on the environment and type of system. We don't really know what's going to come out. What I mean by rubber hitting the road is that the Agency of Ag, Food and Markets is actually, for the first time, going to be inspecting all of these covered farms next year, covered by this produce rule. And so all these farms that know they're covered have been visited already, and they are right now working to develop some additional record keeping logs and get those systems in place so that they're ready when the regulator, the state, shows up on their doorstep.
That's, on one aspect, a bit scary for the farms, I'm sure.
It hasn't been too scary, actually. And I think I'm speaking for most folks on this podcast, I'm hoping, and a lot of the farmers as well. But it seems rather doable. The industry standard does need to move, and some farms have a pretty heavy lift, but it's seeming reasonable, at least currently. When the water and compost stuff comes out, that may throw a little bit of a wrench into the work.
Yeah.
So it's probably a good time just to emphasize that, Hans alluded to this, but the primary experience of the three of us on this call has been in Vermont as a specific state. And so that's the other thing to keep in mind, Michael, for you and your listeners is, of course, the produce safety rule is a national rule, and the implementation is very much a partnership between the FDA at a federal level and individual states. And so what we're describing is, by and large, direct experiences in Vermont. There's a variety. There are a variety of experiences, I think, that growers are having, depending on where they are and where their states are, because the implementation is slightly different in each state.
Yeah, that's key to know. So what kind of, not to get on a tangent here, but what kind of, if someone's out of compliance, what kind of things are they shutting them down? Are they issuing fines? What do you guys see coming down the road?
Fines and shutdowns would be, well, I should say, last case, sort of go to only in a more urgent situation when, the idea with the FDA in general, but the state is to educate while you regulate. This isn't a scored audit that you pass or fail. There'll be comments of where things are not meeting the standard. And if a farm says, yeah, I'd love to, okay, what should I do? And, how about if I do this instead? And regulators, so there's a back and forth, and extension would come in and help the farm come up with some other ideas or implementation strategies. And they come back in a few weeks or a month or next season, depending on what it is. The stuff's written up, and that's more or less what it's going to probably look like almost all the time. And only a shutdown could occur if there was some really, walk onto a farm, there's dead cows floating in all those tanks where the lettuce is being washed, or really egregious conditions. And we don't exactly know what that looks like, but that's where some immediate action could take place. And also if a noncompliance around improvements could issue fines and eventual shutdown, but it would be a pretty slowish process, I imagine.
Gotcha.
Nobody that I know of has a goal of shutting anybody down. That is not what this is about. And it would be a very high bar to cause that type of thing.
Good. I think that's, one of those, because you hear online, and, one of the reasons I wanted you guys to come on was, I posted before we had this podcast, I said, hey, I'm going to be interviewing you guys about food safety. And of course, it brought out some of these people that are very upset about this at all. And of course, they are all putting out the myths, this is going to happen, and this is going to shut my farm down. And I said, guys, this is not the case. This is about creating a better food system. And there's a lot of very, very, very reasonable things here that are just going to basically help you as a farmer.
Yep. One outcome I just want to add to this too, which is now with the produce safety rule and FDA kind of involved on farms, if there is a food outbreak, and this has been the case in the past, but say a farm in Vermont was implicated in some food safety outbreak, that could also cause a fairly dramatic response of either big recall or shutting of the farm down, maybe temporarily anyway.
Gotcha. Just till things are figured out.
Yeah. It hasn't happened.
But to that point, I know we've seen several national recalls. Let's say Romaine was not too long ago. I know we've spent a lot of time lately talking about food safety. Why are these outbreaks still happening?
Well, I will say that they're happening a lot less. There are under 3,000 food safety related deaths each year, and only a small percentage of those are from produce farms. And we're not talking on farms about eliminating risk and making no one ever get sick from anything. We have hundreds of millions of people eating food grown on millions of acres and from many, many farms. And we have microbes all over the place, and we have millions of people that are immunocompromised. And basically what is going to happen is that once in a while, something's going to happen. And there's not a lot we can do about it. What we can do is manage and reduce the risk. And I think that is happening. So it was, just a few years ago, it was, 5,000, or back in the early 2000s, 5,000 deaths a year, and we're at 3,000 in the other, latest one. So food is getting safer, I believe, but there also are variables that are hard to control.
And the media loves a good story. So anytime there is one, they are going to report it to the maximum.
Yeah,
complex system. Lots of ways for things to go off the rails. And Hans makes a great point. It's about thinking intentionally about produce safety and adopting good practices to try to minimize risk. But there are obviously times where best practices or good practices are not followed, or we learn something new. So it's a constant improvement process for sure.
Can you explain a little bit more about the Tester-Hagen Amendment? Because I know that's something that has a lot of growers confused, is if, do they have to comply to the food safety? Are they exempt? What does exempt look like?
So I can take a stab at that, and I welcome Andy and Hans jumping in to correct me or clarify anything. So I think about it in terms of determining qualified exemption. So there's either, you're fully exempt, or you're qualified, or you have a qualified exemption, or you are fully covered. It's the sort of three categories I break it down into. And I'll take a minute, and Michael, hopefully you can include a link in the show notes, but there is a relatively easy to understand decision tree or flow chart from the FDA to help walk through that. It's the complete exemption is based on whether or not you grow produce. So if you're growing produce, then there's some form of coverage. And then it's based on if you grow less than 25,000. Your sales are less than 25,000. So if you're under that, then that's exempt. The middle ground is a little bit more difficult, but it comes down to the level of food sales. Let's be clear, not just produce, but all food sales. So if you are selling even livestock or meat or canned products, that counts in this revenue. If you're selling, based on the level of food sales and then the type of customer that produce alone gets sold to. So there are certain consumers, if you're selling directly to a consumer as opposed to a wholesale market, then it's considered a lower exposure. And so there's those two factors that come into play, and those are what arrive or allow you to be qualified exempt.
That's a pretty good outline there, Chris. I will only add that the majority of more serious Vermont growers that are selling, and making a living doing it are qualified exempt.
Yeah. And so just to put it into real specific context, the criteria are, I'll use the exact wording here, average annual monetary value of food sold during the last 3 years is less than 500,000, and average annual monetary value of food sold to qualified end users. So this is what we talked about. The qualified end users have a couple of definitions, exceeds the value of the total food sold. Again, it's a lot easier to understand looking at this flow chart than in speaking about it. But
there's a little irony in this too, because this qualified exempt, you might think, great, I'm not covered by the rule. Well, unfortunately, that may be true, but what's happening, of course, is that the market expectation and all the buyers, all the markets that many of these people sell into, actually have expectations, at least, or requirements that there's food safety standards, a plan, liability insurance, maybe a certificate of some kind. So these growers are actually in an awkward spot where they really actually need some market verification, either a certificate or some verification that they're doing the best practices that will allow them to sell and keep these markets. So FSMA is in some ways pushing that and the problem that they're not covered.
And the other point is, if you're determined to be qualified exempt, it does not mean you are not covered. It just means you are exempt from the majority of the provisions. You are still required to keep records to continue to justify that exemption.
And if there were ever an issue and your firm is looked into, you would be expected to be following these best practices.
Yeah. So can you talk a little bit about GAP versus FSMA? Because I think there is also some confusion in what those two terms mean.
Yeah, I'll just say real briefly, GAP, Good Agricultural Practices, is a name that was taken by the USDA to describe these best practices to reduce risk. And USDA GAP is a certificate program. It's voluntary, and there is a third-party audit, and you have to score over 80% on a bunch of different things, and you get a certificate. Then FSMA, PSR, the Produce Safety Rule, is not a certificate program. It's an inspection. It's the law. It's like you're on the road and you've got to follow the speed limit. So that's a good analogy. You got to make sure you use your blinker and do all those things. And if you get caught doing the wrong thing, you're kind of in trouble. But the inspections are not scored. You have to comply with the law, and you need, with good intention, to be working to comply if you're not in compliance. So a very different kind of feeling and approach.
But yes, lots of confusion. Partly because when we talk about practices that help demonstrate or achieve compliance with the FSMA Produce Safety Rule, we sometimes refer to them as lowercase g, lowercase a, lowercase p, good agricultural practices, which often gets confused with capital GAPS, a certification program. So we could probably do a better job cleaning up that terminology.
So, kind of how I think of it is, FSMA is more the government, as you said, the law, but GAP is more of a voluntary if you want to sell into some of these additional places that require some sort of certification.
Yeah, I think one analogy might be, the state requires you to have a driver's license, have your vehicle registered, and have insurance. That's FSMA produce safety rule. Yep. You are going to be assessed or inspected against that at some point. You can then go to your insurance company or some other third party and say, I would like to take a defensive driving course to lower my insurance rate. And so that's a voluntary program, or your employer might require you to do that. So that's a case of like the market is requiring the GAPS certificate.
No, I think that's a great way of putting it. So let's move on. What are some of the biggest myths? And I think we've already covered some of this a bit, but that are propagated by small farms around FSMA and just the general idea of food safety.
Like you said, we already kind of talked about the fear that the government's going to come in and shut down the farm and nitpick things that growers might not be aware of. And I think that's a common fear or misconception, just the fear of the unknown, and they don't know what's going to happen. But that muddy water can be cleared up pretty easily by attending a PSA training. I have a good feeling that those who are nervous about this or not sure what to expect haven't been through a PSA training, because the Produce Safety Alliance, yes, there's a lot to it, and it's a full day or even 2 days. But I think once you go through it, you really understand that it's a lot of common sense practices, much of it that you're already doing. And it's just thinking about your process and how you keep things clean and organized, I think takes a lot of fear out for the farmers. And then to realize that, especially for the first couple of years as this program gets rolled out, that a lot of states, New York State Produce Safety Program came up with the slogan, educate before and while we regulate. And I know Vermont and many others are taking the same approach, that, when inspectors are coming on the farm, they're there, they're learning themselves, they're there to teach you. They're probably going to point out some things that could be improved upon, but they're not going to come in and say, we're closing you down, and, unless there's something extremely egregious like Hans was talking about. But they're going to work with you to find a solution to that and to improve the situation. They're not just going to come lock you up.
I have 3 quick myths that are very common, I've heard, and they are, number one, I guess I'm going to have to shoot my dog. That's one. Or shoot my cat. I've heard both of those. And, really it's about identifying that there are risks with having an animal and having a plan to minimize that risk. And that's what has to happen, and not shooting them. And then another one is, I got to get rid of all those wooden bulk bins. Like, absolutely, oh my God, that's going to cost $100,000 or something like that. And it's true that they're hard to wash. They've got to be repaired. And, maybe if you're buying new or replacing, you might think about the plastic ones. A lot of farms have done that and slowly traded them out. But wood is allowable. That wood is not allowable is really a myth. And that also goes with the actual wash pack area where, a farmer, you'll go and Farmer Wolf will say, oh, so look at this. I got these wooden walls. Wow, how am I going to cover those? Or, something like that. So that is allowable as well. Just contact surfaces really want to be either washable or have some ability to keep clean. And wood, right, you can't really wash it or sterilize it, but as long as there's a reasonable system for drying and scrubbing and cleaning, then that could be allowable under the PSR.
No, those are great. Those are really good.
Yeah, I would say just generally the level of specificity of what's ruled in and what's ruled out is, sometimes I'm really amazed at what I'm hearing. And Hans and Andy gave good examples of specific things that either I'm going to have to do X, Y, and Z, or I can no longer do A, B, and C. The reality is, and Andy alluded to it, even at the federal level very early on, the strategy for this was education before and while regulation, or educate before and while regulating. And so that really, I have to say, I keep a pretty broad national view on what's happening, and I do believe that is being practiced in a very genuine sense. And so the level of specificity is following that. As we learn more and as everybody learns more, we can develop more specificity. But right now, it really is pretty broad level guidance.
Yeah, I mean, just the other day, someone was saying, "Oh, I'm going to shoot all the deer on my property," and I was like, "Yeah, no, not really."
If you want to, right?
But yeah, the whole thing was, the animal intrusion that was their idea. So where do you see small farms failing in food safety, and what's the easiest way for them to kind of up their game, comply?
I'll start. I just got done last week with a series of meetings that involved reviewing a lot of early evaluation results from PSA trainings, Produce Safety Alliance trainings, from on-farm readiness reviews. So these, on-farm readiness reviews, or OFRRs, are this pre-inspection educational group visit to a farm to actually walk through and take a look at the readiness of the farm relative to an inspection down the road. So the things that jumped out at me really focused on just plain record keeping. So I think a lot of farms that have been through PSA training and have been through an OFRR, for example, are using good practices. They're just not always documenting that they are. And so a good example is, we do worker training that involves educating them about produce safety practices on the farm. We just never kept a roster. We didn't know what day we did it, or, it's done when they come on board. And so we don't keep a list. So there's things like that. I don't know, Hans and Amy, but that's my sense, is a lot of it, by and large, has just been documentation of things that are already happening.
I think the only thing I'm going to add is that really this is not hitting people by surprise. Back in 2005, 6, 7 to 9, those years, that's where I think this was all first coming down. And the industry has really changed. There's been a lot of change. And the thing that has happened, and the failing, and this is important, is that farm, by and large, the standard has been to kind of get your act together, having systems, organizing stuff, dedicated harvest bins, having flow. It's not just willy-nilly kind of just, grab anything, go harvest this, throw things here, there actually is systems. And that the system comes before the record keeping. And those systems, by and large, have been developed. There maybe are still a few farms that don't have them, but it's an easier leap than one might think when it's really just like the systems are in place, but I got to add and do this record keeping. And isn't that a pain in the butt? But then maybe it will help actually get your system, hone your system, and make it a little tighter, because you have to think about, what things am I actually going to do? And then once you have these records and these logs, you can hand them to an employee and say, I want you to be kind of a manager of this section. And that can do a powerful thing to an employee, a base employee. And so that can help actually make life easier for the farm owner. So there's some good things that come out of this. And the failing, there is an opportunity for positive change. And there aren't a lot of failings where there's really risk at stake and the farms are really doing a crappy job. And it's a dangerous situation, if you will, from a food safety perspective.
Andy, anything?
Yeah, I think not just my opinion, but probably Chris and Hans is slightly biased as well, because we work with the farmers that come to us asking for help and asking for assistance in their planning and thinking about food safety. So as far as seeing what small farms are failing at, I think Chris hit it. A lot of the farms we see are doing the work. They're cleaning up after themselves. They're staying organized. They're training their employees. So it's like, I don't see that there's necessarily a gross issue that needs to be fixed immediately, but we are going on farms that are forward thinking and asking for our help. And I guess if you don't know much about food safety or the easiest way to comply and to learn about it, the next step after that training that we've been talking about is to have an OFRR, an on-farm readiness review, where someone from Extension like us and someone from the State Agency of Agriculture generally come to your farm and walk through just everything about produce safety and your operations, and just kind of get another eye on the situation to highlight any issues that they may see or any areas of improvement and suggestions they may have on how to stay in compliance.
Yeah, Andy, I think that's great, because when we started our farm, my brother and I were 15 and 16. So food safety was kind of like the furthest thing from our mind. So it really did take a few extension agents showing up and saying, hey, you might want to think about this. And then one time they handed us that really super thick GAPS binder and said, you really need to start reading this. So that was key.
Having that extra eye on the situation is always a good idea, because like you said, as a farmer, that's not necessarily the first thing on your mind.
Those are some really big 3-ring binders. They've gotten smaller. It's like the way computers have gotten smaller.
Yes, I'm actually looking at it, and it seriously is about 4 inches thick.
I know. No wonder people were scared.
Yeah, I think that actually is a really good point, is especially, let's say, if someone shows up during the middle of the summer when you're out there trying to get stuff done, and you know how farmers are so busy, and they plunk down this 4-inch binder, they probably just want to throw that thing in the fire. They never want to think about it because it looks like it's too scary. But if you can come to them with, hey, you're 80% of the way there, what are these 20% things that you can do, tweak, just to get yourself to the next level? I think that is going to be so much more empowering to those farms.
Yep.
So let's move into talking about food safe wash and pack systems equipment. And part of that too, let's talk about the word processing versus washing and packing. Can you share the definitions of that first?
Yeah, I'll share my definition. I try to be really careful about use of the word processing in the context of produce safety because it really means something very specific. And it draws a line between the produce safety rule and the preventive controls for human foods rule. And so processing really is changing the form of something. And so it's slicing and dicing or cooking or canning. And really what most farms are doing in a wash pack shed is really washing, not processing. And so I think it's important to just make sure we're clear on that. And I do sometimes cringe when I hear the word processing applied to a wash line because it can raise eyebrows in a regulatory world.
Yeah, and I just had an experience just this week where someone said, oh yeah, no one will buy my salad mix because I don't have a HACCP plan. And I was like, whoa, you do not need a HACCP plan for salad mix. And I think the problem, I'm still trying to clarify exactly what it is, but I think they used the word processing and that triggered some different thinking about what they were actually doing with their salad mix, get it ready for sale.
Right. Good point. I think you were also asking about how we're doing with equipment that supports compliance with the produce safety rule or just good produce safety practice. And it has been somewhat slow, I would say. But one of the things that the produce safety rule has done is really highlight that need. A lot of the time that Andy and I spend is looking into what's coming down the line in terms of new equipment or what are some alternatives that maybe growers don't think about because, when they interned or apprenticed with a grower, they used a certain piece of equipment and that's what they know. And so there are some alternatives out there. And sort of the guiding principle for me on this stuff is you can't clean what you can't see and you can't sanitize what you can't clean. And that was something that Andy and I learned a bit about this summer. We went down to New Orleans for a hygienic design course, and it was just really eye-opening. That very much focused on larger, true processing facilities, food plants. But there are a lot of lessons we can learn from that and apply with common sense to the work we're doing in wash pack sheds.
I want to also just say that equipment, one thing, and then the ways of cleaning them. You can't clean them if you can't see them. Actually, defining cleaning has been one of the biggest leaps and learning curves for the produce community in my last 5 years doing this anyway. And just understanding, does it start with a rinse or you can scrub with detergent, but that needs to be rinsed off and then you sanitize after you're done with that. And just that process, which maybe seems simple once you get it, is not something that has been industry standard.
Andy, you want to talk about specific pieces of equipment and some of the things that we've been learning?
Yeah, sure. There's a couple different examples here that we think about in terms of food safety. Some of the common pieces of equipment like brush washers, barrel washers, green spinners. Several different types of them are available, and each design has its pros and cons for sure. So like barrel washers, there's a common one. The grindstone barrel washer is the wooden one, pretty easy to assemble and cheap to build, and a lot of small farms are running that. But it poses some challenges to be cleaned, being wood, and it works great, and it's cheap to build. But one of the things to keep in mind with that is just clean it the best you can and let it dry in between uses. But there are other things out there. There's polycarbonate drum washers, very similar design, but it's made of plastic. Still, actually, that one is a bit challenging to clean, but it doesn't hold the water so much and it dries out a little quicker. And brush washers, those are pretty common as well, but they're inherently difficult to clean. A lot of people use brush washers for crops that aren't necessarily covered by the produce safety rule. Crops like potatoes that are generally cooked, that is really a good use of that piece of equipment. So some people separate what crops they use on specific pieces of equipment that may be difficult to clean, like the brush washer, for example. Washing machine green spinners, there's a good one. There's many different renditions of this. Some people put their greens right in the washing machine. Some people use laundry bags. Some people use fish basket totes or Rubbermaid tote with holes drilled in it. And what I've been recommending from a food safety perspective is using the fish totes or the Rubbermaid totes with holes in it, because then that is your primary food contact surface, and that is easier to clean than getting inside of your washing machine. So using those baskets, you put your greens in the baskets, and then the baskets can be taken out and cleaned. And obviously you still need to clean the washing machine the best you can, but the priority is slightly reduced because the greens aren't in there. They're primarily being touched by the basket. And I've seen a lot of farms that use the baskets as part of their system so they can just scoop it up. They aren't picking up the greens by hands. They can just scoop right in their bulk tank with that basket and it drains out the water. So that seems to be a nice upgrade and an innovation that's happened the last few years or few renditions of greens washing. We have heard about a new piece of equipment called a rinse conveyor. We know of one specifically called the AZS rinse conveyor. It's fairly affordable. I've heard it's in the ballpark of $7,000, depending on where you live, and shipping is big on that. It's about 12 feet long, 2 feet wide, available in stainless steel and on wheels, and it's set up as a big conveyor belt. And there's a high volume, low pressure rinse, as well as it's 2 stages. So you got the high volume rinse, and then after that, there's high pressure spray nozzles, like a pressure washer nozzle that spin around on bars, both top and bottom of the produce. Think of it like a dishwasher, but with pressure washer nozzles. And these can be adjusted and fine-tuned depending on the crop you're washing. And this piece of equipment works really well. It's really versatile for washing bunched crops. It works great on washing individual crops, beets, carrots, bunched lettuce, bunched carrots, because it hits it with water from both sides. And it's totally adjustable as far as water flow rates and stuff. It seems to be a winner for the farms that have it. The farms that have it do say that it's a little bit tricky to set up, and it's a little bit tricky to kind of dial in what settings work best for what crops. If you have the high pressure too high, you can be starting to take the skin off your carrots and actually do damage. And so you want to dial that in so you're not just pulverizing things, but effectively cleaning it. So that's a piece of equipment that we learned about. We've got a whole video series on this, as well as a fact sheet and several blog posts on our blog. You can get there from go.uvm.edu/rinse conveyor, RINSECONVEYOR. So there's more information there. There's more information on green spinners. Same, go.uvm.edu/greens spinners. So there's a PDF you can download and print, or read about it on the blog, see pictures and videos of the different things that I talked about in action there. So, or if you've got another piece of post-harvest equipment, rinse conveyor or similar, that you think is easy to clean and, has really been life-changing on your farm, we'd love to hear about it as well. So we're open to more suggestions. I think the rinse conveyor is pretty new to the market, and I'd be interested to hear if there are other brands besides AZS producing something similar.
Cool. That's great resources. So we've got only a few more minutes here. Why don't you guys tell us, you've been to a lot of farms, if you could pick one, what would be your favorite farming tool, and how has it changed the farm that you saw it on?
Go ahead, Andy. We got Andy to come out of his shell. Better get him while we can.
Yeah, I got on a roll there a little bit. So I grew up on my grandparents' vegetable farm. So my favorite tool is the tractor.
Okay.
You can do so much with heavy equipment, whether it be site work or material handling with a loader, plowing snow or fields, seeding, haying. these big tools really enable you to do more work than you'd be able to accomplish otherwise. So a tractor, really saves so much labor and time and energy. And there's something really rewarding about becoming a fluid operator of that tractor. It really makes you feel really satisfied when you can use the right tool and get a lot of work done.
That's half the reason I farm, because I love my equipment.
I guess this is not necessarily my favorite farming tool because I'm not a farmer, but the tool that I've seen really make a big difference in a lot of farmers' lives is simply the smartphone, especially over the past 5 years, say. And, especially when combined with good network coverage, if you're lucky, and web-based resources. So it's just has really, from my perspective, transformed how people can stay connected to information resources and to each other. That's usually a good thing. And just being able to get information and ask for or solicit information. It's, I still come back to my role in this whole thing is to be an educational resource and a source of technical support and assistance. And so that tends to be the lens I look at this with, is how do we ensure people can be connected with information and resources that are going to help them. And I think that, the computer in your pocket's pretty amazing.
Yeah, I will agree. And to that point too, Chris, I know we didn't get into it today, but that also helps you with record keeping, being able to have, that mini computer in your pocket to write down those details you need to get when you're in the field. So you don't have to think about them later.
Yeah, Hans, I was actually just thinking this morning for documenting a worker training, have somebody hold up a sign about what the topic of the training was and take a group picture. You've recorded the date, the topic, who was there.
Oh, yeah. That's absolutely true.
Mugshots.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. I have a lot of tools I like, and I have worked on farms and done a lot of gardening myself. And I love the idea of one or two people on a quarter acre or half acre growing really high quality fresh greens and selling them at a premium, and being able to really do something that can't be done on the bigger market, and that empowerment, and really the tools there, the innovation, and this 6-row seeders, that kind of, if you've seen those with the roller on them, being able to prepare beds and grow really high quality greens just as a single person with very empowering. And some of the handheld bed prep stuff. And I do like tractors too, but I want to point out how powerful those tools are.
All right. So one more here, guys. And then I know you guys have to go. Do you believe that now is the best time to start a farm? And if so, why?
I think it depends. I think we have some different opinions on that. I'll start just by saying on the one hand, it's actually a pretty difficult time because the typical markets, the CSA farmers markets that really had created this boon for small diversified farms to get going, has reached an asymptote and in some decline in some ways. And there's a lot of competition on the regular CSA, and it's really pushing, it's hard to get in and find a market in that place. And there's a different side to that as well. And, maybe other people jump in. But, the bright side of that is it's really pushing innovation. It's pushing market development. It's pushing some new stuff. And so it does depend.
Yeah, I'd echo that, and especially because I expect Andy will be more enthusiastic. We should end on a high note. I think if you've seen one farm, you've seen one farm. If you know one business, you know one business. And there are so many different ways to approach this that, it could be a superb time. Anytime could be a superb time to start a farm. I think it largely depends on what is the plan and what is the model. There are lots of different ways to get into the field now that are different than what's been available in the past. And so it doesn't have to be the same way. Yeah, it definitely could be. But I think there are definitely some challenges.
Chris and Hans are, we'll say, a bit older than I, so our demographics are slightly different, but we agree on most things, but our viewpoints do differ at times. So I say absolutely now is the best time to start a farm, as long as that's where your passion really lies. Going forward, the demand for food and farmers is only going to increase. But that being said, the job requirements are steep, and it takes a person who has many more skills or the ability and drive to learn the skills past the romanticized view of farming that's scrolling in front of your eyes in order to be a farmer. You need to be self-motivated, entrepreneurial, physically and emotionally strong, a good communicator, a creative thinker. The list goes on when you think about all the hats you have to wear. And to quote Darby Simpson, it takes a lot of personal grit to run a farm.
Yeah, no, I agree with you that there's always opportunity in the marketplace. And I think as you're saying, Chris and Hans, is that, yeah, if you just want to go out and start a standard farm like has been happening with the CSA model of the farmer's market, that's going to be tough. But if you can think of this in an innovative new way and design your system inside of this, the world is your oyster, and it's a huge opportunity.
Yeah, and there is a huge untapped market of eaters that are folks who are shopping at supermarkets and Walmart. And the question is how to actually make locally grown, awesome food on small farms actually available to those people financially and physically. And if we can figure out inroads into that, and it may require bigger shifts in the market and environment and all sorts of other things over a generation or two, were huge increases.
One of the best things I saw in the past week was I was on this thing. I know I'm an older demographic, but I think it was called Instagram or something like that. Andy, you have to help me out.
Yeah, that program.
That program. Right. That piece of software.
Yeah.
The picture from a grower in the upper Midwest, empty walk-in cooler, and it was essentially, to paraphrase, "Thank you for the romaine outbreak. I am sold out." He was able to capitalize on what was a national challenge by being local and having an alternative and having the trust of his market.
No, I think that's a great note to end on, guys. Thank you so much for being on. I appreciate your time, and I know our audience is going to really appreciate the knowledge you've shared today.
Thanks.
Thank you. It's fun.
So there you have it, another episode in the books. So I'd love if you would hop on over to iTunes and leave us a rating and a review. Those mean everything to us. We love to hear what you're thinking. If you have a podcast guest that you can recommend, please pop on over to the Thriving Farmer Podcast website and leave us a review. That's thrivingfarmerpodcast.com.